Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge. We do a monthly Q&A, question and answer session for our Profiler Training Certification course, which opens up every December, but the Q&A sessions are ongoing. They happen once a month, basically in perpetuity. And we have some really interesting questions that come up. And primarily it's focused on different principles of profiling people or trying to figure out their personality type in a live context when you're talking to the person and asking them questions and allowing their answers to reveal components of how their mental processes or cognitive functions are operating inside of them. And what's interesting is that when Joel and I host these and we get a question, he and I almost always agree on the answer. So we'll give an answer in sort of my perspective and his perspective. But what happened in the most recent Q&A was particularly interesting because we totally disagreed on the answer. And we thought it prompted an interesting enough conversation that we wanted to repeat it here and discuss where we found our way back to each other in the conversation.
Yeah.
So the question was, and I'm going to use some technical terms here. And so, as always, if you are unfamiliar with these terms, please feel free to go to the Personality Hacker website and look up the CAR model and cognitive functions, and please acquaint yourself with those concepts. We're going to talk a lot about those concepts in this podcast. So if you're unfamiliar with them, please feel free to go reference that material. So the question was, does anything positive ever come out of what's called the Dominant-Tertiary loop? Or for those of you familiar with the CAR model, the driver 10-year-old loop. And I was coming at that question from a personal development frame. And I said an unequivocal no, nothing good comes from the loop. And Joel was coming at it from a profiling mentality, which is when you're looking at what emerges from people's behavior. And he said, yes, positive things can come from the loop. And thus spawned a very interesting conversation around whether or not there's ever anything positive that comes from the loop. Now, we created some distinction around what the loop is. And the loop, as we're defining it, is a phenomenon where a person finds themselves going back and forth between their dominant or driver process and their tertiary or 10-year-old process. And they're not consulting their auxiliary or Copilot process at all. And they're just in a loop, right? It just goes back and forth between the driver and the 10-year-old, driver and 10-year-old. And the reason why this happens, and we've talked about, I believe, this before, but this is a phenomenon. It's not something that is a situation where somebody is, say, pulling on their 10-year-old or tertiary process, which happens all the time. And it's not a person using their type dynamics in an interesting configuration. This is specifically a phenomenon where a person is caught. Like, it's happening to them. They're not conscientiously making it happen.
They're stuck.
Right. It's a situation of stuckness. That's a great way of saying it. And the reason why it happens, let's just kind of describe a little bit why this happens to a person, is there's a technical word called attitude. And the attitude is whether or not one of your processes is pointed to the outside world or is extroverted, or if it's pointed towards the inner world or is introverted. So when you have a driver or dominant function, like take, for example, as an ENTP, my dominant process is intuition, but it's an extroverted attitude of intuition. So the attitude of my intuition is going outward or it's extroverted. And another person who's maybe an INJ would also be an intuitive dominant, but they would have an introverted attitude of their intuition. So that's how it works. And when you go around the car or to your cognitive function stack, your Copilot or auxiliary process, no matter what your dominant process is, your Copilot or auxiliary process will always be in the opposite attitude. So for me, as an ENTP, my auxiliary process is thinking, but because my dominant or driver is extroverted, that means that my Copilot or auxiliary is automatically introverted. This makes me a complete person. I'm able to have access to both the outer world and get outer world feedback, And it allows me an ability to go inside of myself and check in with how I'm feeling. So I get access to both worlds.
We talked a lot about this on the podcast called, I think the title was, ambivert, I can't say the word, personality types exist? So this is the idea of an ambivert, somebody that's also an extrovert and also an introvert. Well, that's pretty much all of us because of what you're talking about right here. All of us are ambiverts in some way, shape, or form.
Exactly. And so we have access to both worlds, both the outer world and the inner world, in those two processes. But what's interesting is that because the 10-year-old or the tertiary process is the opposite of the Copilot or auxiliary, that once again alters in its attitude, and it's going to be the opposite of the Copilot. So it actually ends up going back to the same attitude as the driver. So for me, my driver process is extroverted intuition, and my Copilot is introverted thinking. And then if you go to the 10-year-old, it goes back to an extroverted attitude of extroverted feeling. So the reason why we get caught in a loop is that we are unconsciously supporting whichever attitude our driver process is favoring and wanting to stay in that world exclusively. So my loop is extroverted intuition as the driver and extroverted feeling as the 10-year-old. And so I get to stay in the outer world. And my loop means that I don't want to have any inner world, disruption from whatever's going on in the outside world. It might mean that if it's not just an introverted process, for me as an ENTP, it's specifically introverted thinking. So I might be facing some sort of cognitive dissonance, and my instinct or my inner wisdom is telling me that. But I don't really want to face that right now. So I just sort of neglect and ignore all of my instincts, everything inside of me that's going like, maybe you should go rethink this. And I go, nope, I don't want to rethink it. And then I find solace in the loop of extroverted intuition and extroverted feeling. And it looks totally different depending upon your personality type, what the loop looks like. If you're an introvert, your loop is going to be internalized. Oftentimes, it's a piece of information from the outside world that is encroaching upon you and you don't want to see that. And so you go into an internal loop or an inner world loop, introverted. And then you get to believe whatever you want to about reality. It's very convenient. So the loop is always a protective measure against something you don't really want to experience, see, read, or, explore. Like it's something that your unconscious mind is defending against. And that's why you stay in a loop.
So last night on the question answer, when we were talking with our profiler training students, this question came up. The specific question was, can positive side effects come from somebody that is caught in that loop, whether it's an introverted loop or an extroverted loop? Are there positive things that can come from that? And out of the gate, I said, yes, absolutely. Of course there are. And Antonia went into this whole description point of like, well, no, nothing positive can come from that. Because if you're caught in that loop as a person, that's not sustainable. You're going to be unhappy ultimately. You're there because you are avoiding maybe going to that secondary or Copilot process. It's not healthy at all. And I think what the conversation really came down to is from the standpoint of us looking at why we would give the advice or the answer we gave. And again, you hinted at this earlier. I was looking when Klaus asked that question, I looked at it and said, from a profiler standpoint, so if I'm sitting down with somebody to profile them and they're exhibiting behavior that seems positive, the outcome is positive, so like there's actual positive results, it doesn't necessarily mean they're not caught in a loop. That loop that they're caught in can still throw off positive results. Now, I would say that the person themselves may not be healthy, probably not very happy ultimately, and the results they're getting are probably not sustainable, but that loop can still produce side effects that can be perceived to the outside observer as positive. So when you're in a profiling process and you're profiling someone, you're trying to determine their personality type, don't always look at the results as the indicator of what cognitive functions or what their personality is utilizing to get those results. Because sometimes bad mental processes or how your mental processes are working in tandem can still produce positive results in your life. And that's not a really ultimate gauge necessarily. Well, if you're getting positive results, that must mean you're a healthy person and you're not in a loop, for example. So I think that was why I gave my answer of yes, I think that. And I can look back on my life. I've been caught in a loop before. I'm an ENFP. My driver is very simple. It's exactly the same as Antonia's. It's extroverted intuition. NE, we've called it exploration here. My 10-year-old is extroverted thinking, which we've nicknamed effectiveness. That's my tertiary process, 10-year-old process. And there have been times in my life when I've been very exploratory in my perception of the world. I've done a lot of exploration, and then I use my extroverted thinking, my tertiary 10-year-old process of effectiveness, to get the job done, create results in the outside world, completely bypassing any introverted feeling on my part of how I actually feel about this thing, not taking that into account. And I've created non-sustainable positive results from that loop in my life. I wasn't very happy. Again, like I said, they're not sustainable, but I did produce things that I think were, as from the outside observer, would have been positive results, or positive things have come from that.
Yeah, I mean, components like as an ENFP, you might be incredibly industrious and maybe going out for, I don't know, like, I mean, during that time period, you built businesses that you learned from, and you created connections, and you networked, and we still are benefiting from some of the relationships you created at that time. So there were positive things, but you were also like a miserable, sad sack during that time period. Yeah. And the same thing happens with me. Like when I look at every time that I've been like caught in a loop, and remember, like you said, Joel, it's a sense of stuckness. It's not a choice. You are there because you're avoiding something. It's a defensive position to be stuck in a loop. And so there's very relevant information that is attempting to get in, and you are doing nothing to allow it in. In fact, you're creating a defense strategy, like armor against that information. So I think what's really important to understand about a loop is that it's different than this concept of simply utilizing your 10-year-old or tertiary process, which is a question we get a lot, actually, because we're going on and on about the importance of developing your Copilot or auxiliary process. We talk about that ad nauseum. And a lot of people go, okay, but what about the 10-year-old or the tertiary? Do you just neglect it or ignore it? Or if anytime I'm using it, does that mean that I'm unhealthy? And the answer is no. Like your 10-year-old or tertiary, in fact, I think we recently did a podcast on, or some sort of content someplace, about how important your tertiary process is to you. Like you want to honor it and make sure that it's a part of, the overall like conversation in the car, so to speak. But if you're stuck, it means it's got its grip on you and you're not able to utilize all of these components of who you are as healthy tools. They're like, you're the tool, right? Like they're using you as the tool. What's interesting about this concept of positive results being unsustainable is that when you are in a situation where the world is rewarding you for being in a loop, it's really difficult to see how that could be negative. It's only over time that really starts to, like you're bearing fruit, but it's kind of like fruit from the poisonous tree. Like you're bearing a lot of fruit, and also in the end, it's ash in your mouth, to say it poetically. Like you will not be happy fundamentally. Like ultimately, it will not generate happiness, and you probably usually it manifests in a sense of like lack of fulfillment or questions around why you can't get traction. That's usually how it shows up. But contrasting that with the idea of utilizing your 10-year-old or tertiary process, I think being in your dominant and your tertiary at times, when those two are playing together, I think really amazing things can come out of that if it's a choice. So take, for example, for me, again, extroverted intuition, or as Joel mentioned, exploration. And then my 10-year-old is extroverted feeling, or what we call harmony. I use this in performance mode. I'm generally very up and charismatic in a group setting, or at least traditionally I have been, because I've used that to amp up my energy and connect with other people. And oftentimes, like when I'm really connecting with another human being and I'm just feeling like, oh man, this is just like an awesome moment for me, those are the two processes I feel the strongest. My extroverted intuition is like loving the novelty of this new person and how fascinating they are. And my extroverted feeling is all jazzed because I'm connecting with another person, and connection isn't always easy for me. So I feel them very strongly in those moments. But it's never at the cost of my introverted thinking Copilot auxiliary. I'm not going to show up not as me, or not being honest or in integrity in order to preserve that connection. but I will utilize that dynamic between the two extroverted processes in order to keep the connection going and to be amped up and energized and to just generally have fun in that moment. So there's a lot of ways in which utilizing that driver and 10-year-old together can really produce really amazing things. I think of a lot of introverts, that's a lot of times where art is created for them, is in those introverted processes, because they're really going deep inside and kind of understanding what's happening for them. And there's a lot of powerful things for you, Joel. Like that's where you get all your energy to be super industrious for the business, is in that dynamic between the two. So I think a lot of positive things can truly come from it, but make sure you're not being stuck. And stuck means you can't go to your Copilot auxiliary process. Like it's unavailable to you at that time.
Well, I think the thing that's so insidious about this loop idea for us as people, as we're looking to develop ourselves and our personalities, and I can speak from experience, when you hear the message, and again, this is a message, if you've been a longtime listener, you've heard us say over and over again, get into that Copilot, that auxiliary function, and grow that first. That's really the highest leverage place to focus and grow for yourself. What's so insidious about the loop is often it's a trim tab strategy that helps you accomplish whatever it's figured out to accomplish in your life. And the reason why it's become a loop is it's so effective, or it's so powerful for you in the short-term gains. When you're in the grip of something, maybe a social interaction as an INFJ, let's just say, and the hard work of having to figure out how to create the boundaries using your harmony or extroverted feeling process, you're in the moment of it. Like your family showed up for Thanksgiving or a holiday, and you have to host these people, and right now is not the time to work on that. So you fall back onto that introverted thinking part at your 10-year-old or tertiary place, and you get critical or biting, or you put up these really weird, like strong boundaries that are just way aggressive, more than would be normal for you. But man, in the moment, it's just, that works, and you fall back on it because it's something that just comes up for you. This is example, hypothetical for you if you're an INFJ. And everybody has this. All types have a strategy that this loop fulfills for us. It helps us accomplish something in the short term, and it's become something often for us that we don't want to let go of because it's so effective. It gets the job done for whatever purpose it's designed or it's been emerged to do, I guess. That stopping that loop or trying to get out of that and see the thing that you don't want to see, and the hard work that needs to come from that to get into that Copilot process, not only are you stuck in the loop and you're caught there, it's not like you've got any gumption. It's like when you're not exercising a lot, it's really hard to start the first day of exercise, right? There's no gumption to say, hey, I need to go do this, unless the pain of not doing it exceeds the solution that loop's giving you. And it takes a special person, and I'm sure you've got it in you to do this too. I think everybody's got this in them to say, I don't feel the physical effects, exercise, for example. I don't feel the physical effects of not exercising and eating healthy yet, but I know that's coming someday, so I got to get on the stick about this. I got to start working on it now before it becomes a problem in my life. And it takes a person that can look and say, hey, this is working, but I do see its limitation down the road. So my encouragement to you is, even if you don't, quote unquote, feel stuck, you might even be attached to the loop. I was attached to my loop. I'm like, if I give this up, I will be ineffective. I won't be able to accomplish business goals. I mean, this little loop I've got here is really working for me. It helps me in social interactions. It helps me accomplish things in my life. I don't want to give up my best strategy, especially in the short term. And yet it was a little destabilizing. I had to relearn some things. But when I did that and I moved into growing my Copilot auxiliary function, man, my life has changed. That's when the real magic started to happen. Because it's not like that loop, the stuff that you have there, ever goes away. It's not like you completely lose that part of you. That tertiary 10-year-old, and we talked about this in that tertiary podcast you mentioned earlier, Antonia, that serves your Copilot or auxiliary process in the way your mind is wired. So I guess my encouragement to you is, even if you're resisting what we're saying and you really enjoy being there and it's not a pain point yet for you, I'm giving you a warning that it's going to be a pain point at some point. So even if you ignore what I'm saying right now and you're like, yeah, whatever. 3 years from now, when you're in this painful time period, you're going, oh, that's what they were talking about with this loop. got it, and you feel the pain and you know what you need to do, then the message can still apply then as well. But I'd encourage you to look at it now to say, what can I do now, even before the pain happens or the troubles start happening? What can I do now to start shifting my mindset into a growth mindset rather than staying caught where I'm caught right now?
Yeah. Well, and we were actually just talking about this before the podcast, because we are playing a little bit of catch up because we had some sickness, and then we ran an event, and we've been traveling and had company. And we were talking about how you're no longer using anxiety to encourage you to do the things that will, get the things done that we need to get done, right? To catch up. And that was when you used anxiety, that was your Copilot or auxiliary process of introverted feeling, finding an emotional state to serve the 10-year-old or tertiary process of effectiveness.
Yeah.
And so in those moments of the loop, what you'll see is your Copilot comes in, but only if it's in service. It's never, it's never helping add wisdom or guidance. It's only serving the loop. The same thing happened with me when I wanted to stay in connection with the people in my life. And I knew that the only way to be true to my accuracy or introverted thinking process, like the only way to stay true to my intellectual integrity was to break connection. There was a long time where I tried to rationalize my perception of reality. Like I tried to basically rationalize truths that I didn't 100% buy into in order to continue to keep those relationships with people. So when I was in my loop, it wasn't like I wasn't using my Copilot auxiliary. I was just using it in service to the loop. And that's how you break the loop. You break it.
This is what we were going to say earlier about why it's so insidious, is because none of this operates in a vacuum. You're not literally just in a loop and your Copilot or auxiliary function is isolated out and it's not being pulled on at all. The reason why it's so insidious is you still see that part of you showing up and you're like, oh, okay, I've got that part represented. But because it's in service to that loop, it feels like you're still kind of on the right track, or you're pulling upon that part of your personality that's important, that's the growth part for you, and yet it's completely enslaved to this other process that's happening. And I think that's actually why it's such a difficult thing to get out of. It's because it's not operating in isolation. It'd actually be easier if it was just completely isolated in a silo by itself, but it's not.
Yeah, your Copilot or auxiliary is shackled to the wall of the loop. And so that's actually the identifier, is if that's happening for you. And then the change, the shift is then using that 10-year-old or tertiary in service to the Copilot. And that's how you get out of the loop, is that you change the dynamic of who's serving who. And I think we mentioned that in the tertiary podcast. One last thing that I wanted to mention before we wrap up is there probably are reasons why we have access to this loop. I think of it in the same way of why we have fear or anxiety. Like there are probably contexts that we enter or situations we experience that we haven't run a simulation for it, or we don't have any experience with it, or something has jumped out at us that we weren't expecting, that the loop provides almost like a tourniquet situation, where in the moment you're able to sort of hobble out and get some space and then reevaluate and then recognize, oh, next time I can do better by getting into my Copilot and doing it this and this and this way. But you just hadn't done it yet. And so you weren't prepared for the situation. And that's what you did to survive it, basically. It was like truly a defensive strategy. It's the same thing with fear and anxiety. We have it because there was a time period where we were like fleeing predators on the Serengeti. But if we stay in this low-grade fear all the time, if our limbic system believes that we're constantly being chased by predators, but those predators are like, say, bill collectors or whatever, like we just have this low-grade anxiety constantly that something's coming after us, that's when we get ulcers. And there's a great book called Why Don't Zebras Get Ulcers, or Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, which talks about this idea of like the zebra shake, which is after the moment of fear like subsides, zebras just kind of shake it off, and they don't think constantly like, oh my gosh, what if there's another lion waiting behind that tree? They just sort of shake it off. We don't do that. We don't shake it off. We just keep that anxiety going, and then we get ulcers. So we're using a tool that was provided, it provides a great service, and we're misusing it by being there all the time with fear. And I think the same thing can happen with a loop. I think the loop is there to provide like a momentary defense strategy against something that might feel like an assault. But the one thing you don't want to do is do a low-grade version of it all the time, like being trapped and caught in that loop all the time and being unable to sort of shake it off. If you can't shake it off, the same thing happens, is that we end up having sort of these long game challenges or problems, like whatever is the psychological or lifestyle equivalent to an ulcer attached to low-grade fear all the time. These things will manifest themselves. So if you use it at times, it doesn't mean that you necessarily used it wrong or inappropriately. Maybe the context really demanded it of you. But the important thing is afterwards, shake it off, like the zebra shakes it off, and get back into a state where you are at your best self, and then reevaluate the context and situation. And the next time you experience something similar to it, you can show up as a better self.
Thanks a lot, because now I have a Taylor Swift song running in my head. Thank you.
I do not.
For some reason, I don't know why, but now I've just got this Taylor Swift song just running in my head. Like, I'm like, oh man, this is going to be a horrible day now. It won't be a horrible day. I'll figure a way to like it.
See, I have Florence and the Machine in running in my head, which I think might be a superior song. Although if you're a huge Taylor Swift fan and don't like Florence and the Machine, then the Taylor Swift is the superior choice for you.
I have to confess, there are certain Taylor Swift songs that I don't mind. And sometimes you might catch me listening to them every once in a while. But
she just hits you right in that introverted feeling.
But this one, I don't know. Well, but I'll find a way to like it. I promise. Somehow.
Okay.
What do you think? You've been listening to us talk about this. Love to hear your feedback on maybe a situation where you've had that loop running and how you got out of it, or maybe you're still stuck in it. What's been your experience? What is your personal story around this? I think if you came over to personalityhacker.com and you gave your feedback, left a comment or asked a question right below this show, we can get a conversation going around this with the community of other people that would like to talk about this. You can also join our community of like minds over at facebook.com/personalityhacker or twitter.com/personalityhack, HACK.
And if you like this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. And if you would be willing to leave us a rating and review on iTunes, that would be greatly appreciated.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.